Firstly, Alan, thanks to you for championing hydrogen as an agenda as part of Australia's energy transition. There's lots of cynics along the way, and maybe Alan would even agree he was a cynic. And a few of us got him over a longer session and he couldn't get away from us, and he's become somewhat of an evangelist, I think is the right terminology. But we all believe that there's something to be had on this topic of hydrogen finally. And thanks for expressing it in such a clear way. And anybody that knows Alan knows that he won't put his name to something that he actually doesn't deeply believe anyway, because it actually won't get past the first stage of a scientist's mind. Can this actually make sense? So thanks, Alan, very much for joining us and explaining which way Australia wants to go in that hydrogen story. I love the definition, Alan. Hydrogen means lots of opportunity for Australia. That's a great one. I must use that over. And as Alan said, there are other countries in the world that are actually already on this journey. Europe particularly has seen to meet their own aspirations for low emissions targets, need to come with this power to X terminology, come to terms with it. And actually Germany has put on at the next G7 and G20 summit in Riyadh this whole discussion of how does the power to X work? How do we use renewable energy, electricity, for the creation of all sorts of other pathways, alternatives to what we currently use. Alan also referred to this competition, and I think the danger for Australia lies in the comment that the World Energy Forum sees Australia as a giant of hydrogen, and we don't see ourselves as a giant of hydrogen yet. And that's the importance of the work that Alan is doing, because there is a competition emerging. You can imagine there are other places in the world that have solar resources who also want to play part of this. So it's got to a point now, I think, that we need to move from pilots up into scale and get serious about this topic. I now have the pleasure of welcoming Ben Wilson, CEO of Gas Infrastructure Group Australia, Felicity Underhill, General Manager of Strategy Hydrogen from Origin, and of course Alan. And I will move now across the other side of the stage. Maybe I'll walk down the front so I don't slip over. But Alan, maybe whilst I'm walking...
You're very talented.
Yeah, thanks. I can walk and talk. It's a male thing, you know. Can you say a few words about the scepticism initially and why? And, just a couple of chestnuts. We always used to hear, well, hydrogen explodes, we can't manage it. You need water, Australia hasn't got water. And anyway, won't that just jack up our energy prices?
So I genuinely was sceptical. I mean, first of all, the idea of hydrogen as a fuel, not hydrogen as a chemical, but hydrogen as a fuel has been around for a long time and gotten nowhere. With the exception of rockets, the second and third stage of the Apollo mission to the moon were fueled by hydrogen, but that doesn't use a lot of tonnage. In fact, they used it because it was light. So it's come up again and again and again and not gotten anywhere. Back around about 2010, 2011, I was working for a company. Shall I lower this or something? There's a lot of echo. I was working for a company that was doing electric car infrastructure, the charging stations. And we were purely looking at cars. And when it comes to cars, electric cars versus hydrogen, there are some advantages in using batteries. The numbers work out, the weight works out, and you can charge at home, and they've got fantastic power, and they actually use the original electricity more efficiently. Just a fact. So we used to look at that and say, well, why would anybody want to use hydrogen? But we had a narrow perspective that we were in battery electric car infrastructure business. So at that time I was absolutely sceptical of it. And then I sort of kept hearing more and more. I became open-minded. My current journey started, in a sense, because of Siemens. So you'll recall, Jeff, that I don't know, it was 2.5 years ago, I was doing the electricity review, and in the process of that had a delegation that had gone to Europe. You were doing the Industry 4.0 work for the Prime Minister, and happened to, in the same week, be going to Europe. And I think it was the German ambassador did an event at her home for both of our Australian groups. And you had a lot of your customers with me, and I think you must have lined it up in advance, because every single one of them came to talk to me about hydrogen. They all wanted to talk about hydrogen. And that made me start thinking, hey, there is something there, or possibly something there. And so when I finished the electricity review, I started looking into it more carefully, brought a group of thinkers together, and eventually we created a vision statement that we gave to the COAG Education Council. And Jeff, you found me one of your people to be on the steering committee, and Ben, you were, and a couple of the people in the audience were on this committee as well. And we put together a briefing document, or a vision statement, for the COAG Energy Council last year, and they bought the idea of at least going to the next step, which is to develop a national hydrogen strategy. So in that sense, I've been through the journey of being sceptical, sitting on the side, being a believer, and as you said today, maybe being an evangelist. But I need to make it very clear, hydrogen is part of the solution. What we want is an orderly transition into a zero emissions future, and the heavy work will be done by solar and wind, but they're not always convenient. And Ben perhaps will speak later on about reusing the assets we've got in the built environment. The only way we can do that effectively is with hydrogen substitution of natural gas rather than electrical substitution, and in big transport, as we talked. So I do deeply believe that there's a fabulous opportunity for hydrogen in future to be carrying 10, 15 or 20% of the energy that we need, but the heavy duty will come from solar and wind. But 10, 15 or 20% is an enormously important contribution in an industry as big as the global energy industry. The Hydrogen Council, which is an international group, is predicting from a bottoms-up analysis that the hydrogen industry will be about a $2.5 trillion industry in 2050. It's massive, even at 15% of the total energy industry.
Just to, before you leave the point and move on to Felicity, the water topic. People say, well, Australia doesn't have water, how can we do electrolysis?
So you do need water to make the hydrogen, even if you're doing the fossil fuel pathway. Either way, you need quite a lot of water. But when you do the numbers, whilst it's a significant amount of water, it's still well within the kinds of usage patterns that we have in Australia. So if you're only looking at fresh water, if we project out where Australia might get to on an optimistic scenario as a user and exporter by 2050, we would be using about a quarter of the amount of water that the mining industry uses today. A tiny fraction of what the agricultural industry and the cities use. Nevertheless, it's not uniformly spread over Australia, and so you might have distributional problems, but there are alternatives. Potable, recycled water. You don't have to use potable water, but you can use recycled water. And it's actually not expensive to use desalinated water. And we happen to have in Victoria a desalination plant that's not working very, very hard. So, but even if you build a desalination plant, it only adds 10 or 15% to the future low-cost target of hydrogen. So it's a manageable problem.
Good. Felicity, so that's a nice segue into Origin being the owner of many power generation assets in Australia and making this transition. And it's too often said that there will be an overnight switch from one to the other, but of course we're still going to be, I think you said 80% of all fuels sources still fossil, and will need to be for a while. How does Origin see that transition?
Yeah, well, we're obviously investigating now exactly where hydrogen will sit within that future energy mix. But what is clear is it will sit somewhere, and it's really a matter of that orderly transition. So there are immediate options where it competes today with diesel. So it competes on a cost of energy basis today with diesel, and it competes even more so on a life cycle cost of energy, and therefore per kilometre basis. So we could immediately see a a place for hydrogen in the heavy vehicles, the return to base, etc. There's a lot been said about whether hydrogen could be used as an energy storage medium. And actually, the round cycle efficiency is not fantastic for that. And so maybe we're looking at whether the flexible load of the electrolyzers is actually something that will have more impact for Australia as a whole, where say you have a 100 megawatt electrolyzer, that load can be turned on or off. And so in periods of peak demand, you're going to be able to turn that down and redirect the load on the network to where it's really needed. And so I think there's real benefit with that, but that comes with cost as well. And for us to make this transition, we're going to need everybody in the whole energy supply chain to come on board and be much more collaborative than we may have been in the past. The economics mean that actually it's really tough to make a network-connected electrolyzer work because of network costs. And so we're going to need to be able to work with network operators, for example, on how we do that and reuse that existing infrastructure.
Yeah, which takes us to sector coupling and injection into gas pipelines. How do you see that developing, Ben, at Gas Infrastructure Group?
Sure. So I think there's a fantastic opportunity actually to initially blend hydrogen and then eventually fully convert the gas distribution networks to deliver pure hydrogen. Now that's an interesting thing for us to do as the gas distribution sector, because we're very conscious that as the electricity sector decarbonises, the focus will come more and more onto the gas sector to say, what are you doing to decarbonise? Today, compared to coal, certainly, and still most electricity in Australia is produced by coal. Compared to coal, we're very much a low carbon option, but that won't always be the case, or it may not always be the case. So we want to make this transition. It's good for us. But it's actually also good for Australia. And the reason for that is the scale of the gas networks. The gas networks are enormous. And you would have got a sense of that from Alan's talk, where he talked about how much electricity is required to produce the same amount of energy as the amount of LNG that we export. So the gas distribution networks here in Victoria, today, they deliver twice as much energy to your home as the electricity network does. And they do that reliably because they're underground and with built-in storage. So we have two alternatives. If we want to decarbonise the amount of energy that's delivered to your home through the gas networks, we can either reuse that infrastructure which has already been built, already been paid for, and substitute over time the methane that we currently deliver with hydrogen, or we can disconnect those gas networks and replace them with electricity. But because twice as much energy is delivered through the gas network, you don't quite have to replace it joule for joule, because you can go from gas combustion heating to reverse cycle, but you would need to at least double the electricity network. At least double. You need to build a whole new electricity network to replace that heat load. Whereas, somewhat counterintuitively, the delivery mechanism for hydrogen already exists. It's the gas networks. And in case you think that maybe it's a bit of a stretch to deliver hydrogen through the gas networks, that is what we actually used to do. So before we had natural gas, we had town gas made from coal, so it's the dirty hydrogen that Alan was talking about, and that was delivered, and town gas was about 50-60% hydrogen. So we've actually been there before, and places in the world like Singapore and Hong Kong actually still deliver town gas being mostly hydrogen. So there's a massive opportunity actually to decarbonise our heat sector, the gas sector over time, by moving from methane to hydrogen. There's another benefit, which is how do we get past the chicken and the egg that Alan showed? If we want to unlock this fantastic export opportunity, we want to have low carbon transportation, how do we get past this supply-demand chicken and egg? And the gas networks can do that because the demand is there. You can produce hydrogen today, you can stick it into the gas network and sell it as methane. So the market is already there. We could do 10% hydrogen in the blend in many places around the network, and that's a lot of hydrogen to kickstart that market and get us ready for scaling up to export. How
significant is the emission result of injecting 10% hydrogen?
Yeah, and you've got to be careful here. And again, Alan made the point about the mass difference between hydrogen and methane and the volume distance. So 10% by volume is about 3 or 4% by energy. So doing 10% blending is a relatively modest emissions reduction in terms of what happens into the gas networks. but it's a lot of hydrogen, and it builds that scale and gets us ready. Then, if we're at 10, can we go 20, 30, 40, 50? The problem is the appliances. The burning characteristics are slightly different. It's a bit like the difference between an LPG barbecue and a natural gas barbecue. So if we wanted to go to 20, 30, 40, rather than progressively have to go around and adjust everybody's burners every 5 years or so, what you're better off doing then is sectionalizing and starting to convert whole sections of the network to 100% hydrogen. And maybe we start with new subdivisions, right? So maybe within a 5-year period, we develop a product. So you know what, from now on, a lot of new subdivisions, they're going to be on pure hydrogen, maybe with a local electrolyzer and embedded generation. And that's how you go. Of course, when you're doing that, then you're zero carbon.
Maybe back to you, Ellen. There is work done elsewhere in the world. We're not by ourselves. To what extent can we leverage what's already been done? I guess Australia's got a bit of a history of wanting to reinvent things per our own standard. How much do we need to continue to do ourselves, and how much leverage could we get by working elsewhere as well?
So we will clearly leverage a lot from international partners, and that's one of the reasons we're going to be looking at bilateral discussions, not only on the trade but on R&D as well. So when we talk to Japan, when we talk to Korea, we're finding they're very interested in working with us on R&D, partly so that they can test some of their production technologies in the Australian environment, but partly because of the knowledge that we've got. Some of our universities are doing some really good work on high efficiency but currently very low throughput electrolysis alternatives. The CSIRO is doing some fantastic work on being able to reconstitute or extract the hydrogen from ammonia at the import terminal end if the hydrogen was shipped as ammonia. But in terms of, say, the technology that would use a large fraction of the hydrogen, and that's the transport technology, we are currently not in the making cars business, so we are entirely dependent on other countries. The lead countries on making vehicles are for passenger vehicles, absolutely Japan and Korea, but they're also stepping up now to do trucks, and the Americans are doing trucks. I don't know when we'll be able to get right-hand drive vehicles into Australia, because chicken and egg again on the technology in this case, until there is enough demand for that conversion, it's difficult for us to get started in the area. We are learning from the experience of others, so around the world, especially in Netherlands, where we've been to visit, to see, and to the UK, there's a lot of interest in doing what Ben was describing. But interestingly, they're a little bit stuck by their own regulatory processes and the difficulties of getting going. AGIG, under Ben's leadership, and Gemina and ATCO have started in Australia small projects. I say small, but several hundred houses to do exactly this. And it's neck and neck. We might be the first in the world to get a project. Would we be the first in the world if your project was to be running this year?
We've got a sister company in the UK which is trying, but I think we'll get there first.
There you go.
So that pilot project is the one in South Australia? Is that the one you're referring to? What's that project about?
So this project is to install, it's called Hydrogen Park South Australia, and we're working in partnership with the South Australian government, who's contributed to the funding for this. It's a Siemens...
surprise. Okay.
How about that, eh?
Did you know?
It's a 1.25 megawatt electrolyzer. It'll be installed at the Tonsley Innovation Park in Adelaide, which is the old Mitsubishi factory. It's have a mains connection, and it will buy renewable power over the grid via a PPA. It will take water from the city of Marion, and it will produce hydrogen, and then that hydrogen, we will blend that into our local gas distribution network. So we're sectionalizing part of the network. It's a suburb called Mitchell Park. So it's real customers, real appliances out there, and about 750 homes from the middle of next year will be on a blend of 95% methane, 5% hydrogen. So we have 2 million customers, and we're going to have 700 of them on 5% hydrogen, right, in a year's time. So it's a small start, but it's a start. And you know what? We tick off a lot of things by doing it. So we're doing, through the Future Fuels CRC, a whole bunch of appliance testing to make sure that the appliances can deal with this. And we test the appliances actually up to 20%. So we're only putting 5% in, so that should be fine. Today, we need to come down the cost curve. So we're doing also a lot of work to understand how we get down that cost curve quickly and what else we can do to optimize the economics. So hydrogen to the gas network. We're also exploring whether we can do some tube and trailer, so we can deliver hydrogen to industrial customers by truck, whether we can do some refueling. And then, of course, the electrolyzer produces hydrogen, but it actually also produces oxygen as well. That's the other product. Generally, we just vent that to atmosphere, and then when you burn the hydrogen, it joins back up again. But actually, there may be a market for that oxygen. So that could be another revenue stream for these projects. Then, of course, on a larger scale, there's the grid support, there's the demand-side response that these projects can represent. So it will be, I think, pretty much first in the world that I'm aware of into an actual public network, not a private network somewhere, from around about the middle of next year.
Can I add one other aspect to your question? So in terms of working with international partners and learning, a huge consideration on developing a hydrogen economy is safety.
Yeah.
Now, the Europeans and the Americans have been looking at hydrogen's potential for really a long time, at least 20 years, and committed a lot of resources to institutes and agencies to develop guidelines and standards for safety. And in the last couple of years, we've been interacting with them more and more. For the National Hydrogen Strategy, we're getting various elements done by state government departments because there's a lot of interest. And the South Australians in particular are leading the work that we're doing on safety. And South Australia next month will be hosting an international conference on hydrogen safety. And through this process, we're starting to close the gap. And I think that we're achieving world parity with world safety standards, and that's critically important because the project at AGIG and Gemina and ATCO, those projects, they need to be able to confidently state to their customers that this is going to be at least as safe, if not safer, than what they're used to with their natural gas in their homes. And I think that's absolutely deliverable, it's achievable, given the work that's been done by others and now more and more by Australians.
Absolutely. I mean, hydrogen is a flammable gas, so is methane. And we know how to safely transport and deliver flammable gases. That's what we do. There are actually some benefits. Firstly, no possibility of carbon monoxide poisoning if you're using hydrogen. The other thing about hydrogen, it is incredibly light. And so if you have a leak, it will disperse very, very quickly in all directions and ultimately just go straight up, actually. So there are differences and similarities to methane. Overwhelmingly, there are more similarities than differences in terms of handling it. And overall, there's no reason why it shouldn't be as safe. And indeed, it is reticulated in various places around the world today.
Perhaps I'll jump on to the topic of export, this lure of being able to export this sun, as you put it, Alan. If I go to origin, you would have a realistic check on, okay, how plausible is that vis-a-vis your exports of natural gas? Is there some work that's been done so far to give us an idea what still needs to be done to make that work?
Yeah, absolutely, and there are a lot of learnings from the LNG industry here as well. Origin obviously had a bit of a front seat to the creation of the CSG to LNG industry in Queensland and therefore able to take on those lessons. And I think there are a few similarities and some things that we could change. One is we wouldn't have developed those gas resources without the benefit of the scale of the export demand. And that is what enabled us to justify the infrastructure that was required to develop those resources. The demand existed internationally, and I think that's what we're seeing here as well with hydrogen. The demand from Japan and Korea in particular will exceed the demand domestically, at least over the next 10 years, particularly for Japan. And so if we were able to start capturing some of that demand, that will help justify the investment in commercial scale hydrogen developments. The second thing that we would need to do, however, is ensure that those initial export facilities around hydrogen and the production leave some capacity and some production available for the domestic market. And you would use then that production to stimulate the demand domestically,
Yep.
to make sure there were volumes available to help those first bus fleets come on, to help green some industrial feedstocks, etc. The benefit then of scaling up through export will be seen in the cost reduction, starting to order larger scale electrolyzers, to see that cost curve come down, otherwise it stays just on paper. And then by the time the demand in Australia has come up domestically, the costs have come down, and so we can actually benefit more from it, as opposed to, it's something which is probably 3 times the cost of natural gas today.
Alan, perhaps I'll throw back to you and ask the question. You mentioned blue hydrogen. So take the project down in Victoria that's using brown coal, using that energy that's stored and sequestering. Is there going to be a mechanism to differentiate between green and non-green? And is there an opportunity to blend? You mentioned Hastings. Could we ever imagine to be sending green and non-green hydrogen out from Hastings? How might that work?
Sure. So you're talking in a colour code. Maybe I should quickly explain the colour code. So green is used to refer to hydrogen that was made through solar or wind electricity. Blue is what is often used to describe hydrogen that's made from the fossil fuel pathway with CCS. I think people say brown if it's done without CCS, and purple is if you start with nuclear electricity, so it's chromatographically rich. Part of what we will be recommending in the National Hydrogen Strategy is a provenance tracking system, or a certificate of origin system. And the 3 main things that need to be tracked, because customers care. I've got to point out, the hydrogen itself is indistinguishable. I don't know that there's any way that you could distinguish any hydrogen by its colour or by any other characteristic as to where it came from. Hydrogen itself is clean at the point of use, so it all goes back to the point of origin. That's where the concerns are. So people want to know what country it came from. That's for political reasons, and also, they want to know that it comes from countries that have respect for employees and don't do slavery, etc., etc. It's legitimate. People want to know what the technology was, and that is beyond me, because I constantly say, and have been for 3 years, the only thing that counts is the emissions of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and the technology should be completely and utterly irrelevant. But other than myself and maybe a couple of people in this room, everybody else cares about the technology. So we will track the technology. Was it from fossil fuels or was it from solar and wind? And then the third thing is a number associated with every kilogram of hydrogen, how much carbon dioxide was emitted in the manufacturing of that hydrogen. And in the future, there will be no countries that will import hydrogen that was made from natural gas or coal without carbon capture and storage, because the numeric kilograms of carbon dioxide per kilogram of hydrogen produced would be too high. But exactly how low it has to be will depend on each customer country and each customer. So it just turns out that, as a rule of thumb, around about a kilogram of carbon dioxide per kilogram of hydrogen means that the hydrogen you're using is much, much better for the environment than if you used the methane or the coal in the first place. But there will be some countries that say, look, we'll buy it if it's 0.5 of a kilogram or less. Others will say 1 kilogram. We want to track that using blockchain or whatever technology, so that every kilogram of hydrogen can be tracked. Then think about Victoria. Let's say, I don't know what the final number will be, but let's say that brown coal hydrogen in Victoria is being produced at 0.8 kilograms of carbon dioxide per kilogram of hydrogen, and a particular country is willing to import it if it's 0.5 or less. Well, if we were producing from offshore wind farms or onshore solar hydrogen that is 0 kilograms, but more expensive than what's coming out of the coal pathway, if we can track it adequately and blend it, those customer countries and customer companies might be quite happy to buy the blend that will therefore be below 0.5. and get the best price by doing that. So I think if we can get the mechanism right, how it's used will be up to the individual importing countries and the individual importing customers, and the cleverness with which companies will collaborate to do that blending.
Fascinating. Any other inputs before I go out to the audience for Q&A? Anything that I've not asked that you wanted me to ask? Perhaps Felicity.
It's just something on how we make the step from where we are now to the scale that's required.
Yep.
And the viability of green hydrogen, the renewable energy, lives or dies on the cost of your energy input.
Yep.
Right. So we do need to really stay as close as we can to the reducing cost of solar and wind, but also look at reusing the existing infrastructure wherever possible to make those steps.
The transition.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, and as I said, we're at the practical end of it. What drives the cost of green hydrogen? It's three things. It's the price of electricity, it's the capital cost of the electrolyzer, and then it's the load factor that you can get. So you need cheap electricity, you need a cheap electrolyzer, and you need a high load factor. And today, the electrolyzer is still quite expensive. You can get cheap electricity or a high load factor, but not both. So for our project in South Australia, we're buying the power pretty cheaply, but we're only going to be running 30-40% of the time off peak. And what you need is to get both. And one good way to do that is coincident wind and solar. If you can find a place with good wind and solar resource, then you've got a chance of getting cheap power at a high load factor.
Okay. At that point, I can not see the microphones, but we've got some questions. I can see a hand up right at the back. If you could just identify yourself and choose your panellist.
Whoa. First question. Sorry, Rob Dickinson, Hydrocity Systems and University of Australia. I'd like to invite Alan to translate this into terms that everybody can understand. But really the answer is all about technology readiness level. The focus was on three main issues, and the third one was diversity of supply. And the subsequent talk was about electricity to hydrogen and fossil fuels to hydrogen. For me, within the 100-year horizon that you're referring to, the third one that's going to dominate the other two is photons to hydrogen, or photons through water to hydrogen without going through electricity. So question for you, can you translate that into terms that the people can understand? And for Jeff, perhaps, as Siemens going to invest in photons to hydrogen without going through electricity, or do you only do electricity?
So if I can try to make sure that I've got your question right, you're asking about how viable it might be to directly capture sunlight, which is photons of light,
Yes.
And produce hydrogen directly without going through the intermediate
Correct.
step of
Correct, yes.
making electricity going into an electrolyzer. Is that correct?
Yes.
There's certainly a lot of work being done around the world, and there's a lot of work being done on that at the ANU, the Australian National University in Canberra. I didn't put it up because it's too lab scale at the moment. No one's been able to progress it to even early stage promise of commercialisation, and so I don't want to build any thinking or strategic thinking around that. It's not even clear to me that it will necessarily be cheaper because it's a different complex process. You produce your hydrogen over thousands of square kilometres because it's being produced where the sun is landing. Whereas when you do it with solar electricity, that electricity is being concentrated in wires and going to a single electrolyzer, out of which comes a huge stream of hydrogen, which is easy to catch. Easy to capture. So it might work. I'm not disparaging it. It really might work, but it's got a long way to go.
I won't double guess Australia's chief scientist on the answer to that one, other than to say it's not about a single technology. We're here talking about hydrogen as a means of energy transition, and there are others. What we're trying to be is make sure this is a neutral discussion and play to Australia's natural advantages. In this one, that's why we've tried to convince Alan. There are research elements that we have in our test labs in Germany. Siemens spends $7.5 billion Australian dollars per year in its own research. So it's not a small spend each year to make sure we're looking at those sorts of technologies, including. Any other comments on that one? Any other questions on the floor? I've got one up on the far left, my left. Sorry, that was the furthest distance you could possibly travel. 10 to.
Patrick Hartley here from CSIRO. Thanks for a great discussion. So the race is on. We've heard that, and we all agree, I think. The world is watching. What does Australia have to do to really signal that we're open for business?
Well, each can have a go. Perhaps you want to go first?
Yeah, slightly from our perspective. I think, we've done a lot of talking, we've done a lot of studies, a lot of reports. We've actually now starting to do a fair number of pilots and R&D projects. We actually need now to go to the next step, the next scale. We've talked about the chicken and the egg, and I think the gas networks are a way to get around that. But of course, there's another trap of all of this, which is scale needs to build for cost to come down. But before we can build scale, the costs need to come down, and how do we get through that? And I think actually what we need to do as a gas sector is get together jointly and start a conversation with the large suppliers of electrolyzers and so on to say, look, if we want to do 10% blending in the gas distribution networks, that is about, let's call it 8 to 10 gigawatts of electrolysis, and then a similar amount of solar and wind behind the meter. What does it cost? What's involved to actually start executing that over a 5 to 8 year period? We can carry on doing pilots, but I'm not sure we're going to learn much more from the second, third, fourth, fifth pilot. We actually need to move to that position. I talked about the 3 factors which drive the cost of green hydrogen. If we look realistically about where these can get to, and this is in our submission to Dr. Finkel's hydrogen strategy, I think it's quite plausible that within the next 10 years, we can be producing green hydrogen at scale at around the $10 a gigajoule type level, which, because of the high price of wholesale gas in Eastern Australia, is actually competitive. And that's with no subsidy. If we can then, on top of that, access some ARENA funding, Clean Energy Finance Corporation, Northern Australia Fund, there's plenty of money out there for the right projects, then maybe that is something that we should be aiming for. That is a lot of hydrogen, and that will go very well with starting to build hydrogen for transport, hydrogen for export, and that would take us to the next level. Patrick?
Felicity?
Yeah, I think I'd say there are 3 things. The first is we need to look at this as Team Australia. So Ben and I won't be competing. We won't be competing with others internally within Australia for hydrogen projects. We're going to be competing globally to be able to capture that global demand. So I think we should really be focusing on those partnerships and working out how we're going to work together on this. The second thing is we need to capture that demand. So for those initial commercial scale projects, moving beyond the demonstration projects, moving beyond we're going to reassure ourselves that this works. We're going to learn from the fact that a lot of these demonstration projects, and in fact scale projects, are happening globally. And so we need to start capturing that demand and committing to supplying hydrogen internationally. And the third is we then need to make sure that we are building that domestic market. So what can we do to stimulate that growth? How can we start to build pathways into green energy or green feedstocks for industry as well as for energy purposes?
No?
I would add that just developing the national hydrogen strategy is already attracting a lot of interest around the world and telling people that we're serious. We will be hosting in Australia next month a Korean delegation. We will be hosting in Australia next month a Japanese delegation all about hydrogen, so that's really quite exciting. We need to get the framework right because it's not obvious that there is a single killer app. And if we can get the framework right, then the smart people in industry will seek their opportunities. It may be that at a future date, state and federal governments will pour a lot of money into supporting the industry through ARENA, through the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, but that in itself won't be enough if we don't have the international demand. So we have to work internationally, get the framework right so that as soon as there are growing opportunities, we can capture them faster than other people. And the last thing is we have to be patient because it's not going to be overnight.
I think that's not a bad point. I'm getting the wind up on the left. Maybe I'll make a comment about, because it's topical, the moonshot projects and man going to the moon with the technology that he had at that time. I know Alan was deeply involved in the collection of moonshot projects for Australia. And one of the moonshot projects that Australia selected, Alan, if you recall those days, was to take a city in Australia and make it a hydrogen city. Is that totally off the agenda?
Not totally. So Jeff was referring to a innovation strategy that was submitted to the government by Innovation and Science Australia on their request. And we thought that to help with the culture of innovation, it would be fantastic if there could be some accepted moonshots, and 3 were put forward. 2 of them are actually committed to. One was a health project based on genomics, so it's a genomics health for mapping out the Australian population. The one was Great Barrier Reef, and a lot of money was put in on that project. There was some controversy, you might recall, about how the money was put in, but it is that project. And the third one was a hydrogen city. And in a sense, the fact that we've been asked to do the National Hydrogen Strategy is
somewhat bigger.
It's sort of like a consequence, or it's an outgrowth of that, and a very positive one. So it's not as easy to commit to doing a hydrogen city where everybody's house will be converted and vehicles will have access to refueling stations. But there are a lot of cities of 30 or 40 or 50,000 people around Australia who have come to me already saying, can we get some support to be a hydrogen city? They're quite excited to do that. We will be recommending hubs, and there are a number of state governments that have come to me and said, we've got a perfect location for an industrial hub and port that would be centred around hydrogen. So I think something tangible will come from it.
That's a great place to leave it. Thank you. Thanks, Felicity, Alan and Ben. And Kelly, thank you for your opening remarks as well from Jacobs.